The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the Whitmore estate as Margaret Thompson adjusted her worn apron and prepared for another day of cleaning the mansion that had been her workplace for over 20 years. At 62, her hands showed the evidence of decades spent scrubbing floors, polishing silver, and maintaining the pristine appearance that wealthy families expected. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her kind eyes reflected the wisdom that came from years of observing the lives of the privileged from the shadows. Margaret had started working for the Whitmore family when she was just 42 years old, fresh from a divorce that had left her struggling to support her teenage daughter, Sarah. The job at the estate had been a lifeline, providing steady income and modest living quarters in the staff wing of the massive house. Over the years, she had become more than just hired help to the family, particularly to Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the matriarch who had grown fond of Margaret's gentle nature and unwavering dedication. The Whitmore family had built their fortune in real estate and investments, with patriarch Robert Whitmore expanding the business empire his grandfather had started in the early 1900s. Their estate sprawled across 50 acres of prime land just outside the city, complete with gardens, a private lake, and enough rooms to house a small village. Robert Whitmore was known in business circles as a shrewd negotiator who rarely showed emotion, treating most relationships as transactions to be managed rather than connections to be cherished. On this particular morning, Margaret noticed something different in the atmosphere of the house. Mrs. Eleanor had been ill for several weeks, confined to her bed with what the doctors had initially dismissed as a common respiratory infection. However, her condition had worsened rapidly, and the family had been gathering more frequently, their hushed conversations filling the usually quiet hallways with an undercurrent of concern and anticipation. As Margaret dusted the antique furniture in the main living room, she overheard fragments of conversation between Robert and his eldest son, James. They were discussing arrangements, speaking in the clinical terms that wealthy families often used when dealing with unpleasant realities. The words, "when the time comes," and "preparations" drifted through the air, causing Margaret's heart to sink as she realized they were already planning for Mrs. Eleanor's passing. Margaret had developed a special bond with Mrs. Eleanor over the years. Unlike her husband, who barely acknowledged the domestic staff, Mrs. Eleanor had always treated Margaret with respect and genuine warmth. She remembered birthdays, asked about Margaret's daughter's progress in college, and had even helped pay for Sarah's medical school tuition when finances became tight. In quiet moments when the rest of the family was away, Mrs. Eleanor would invite Margaret to sit with her in the garden, sharing stories and treating her more like a friend than an employee. The relationship had become even more meaningful after Margaret's daughter Sarah had graduated medical school and moved across the country to begin her residency. With Sarah gone, Mrs. Eleanor had filled a void in Margaret's life, providing the maternal connection that had been missing since Margaret's own mother had passed away years earlier. They shared a love of old movies, classic literature, and long conversations about life, dreams, and the complicated nature of family relationships. As the days passed, Margaret watched the family's behavior with growing unease. While Mrs. Eleanor lay upstairs fighting her illness, Robert seemed more concerned with business matters and the practical implications of his wife's condition than with her actual well-being. The couple's two sons, James and Michael, visited dutifully but spent most of their time in their father's study, discussing financial arrangements and inheritance matters with the family attorney. Margaret found herself spending more time in Mrs. Eleanor's room, bringing her tea, adjusting her pillows, and simply providing companionship during the long, difficult hours. Mrs. Eleanor's condition fluctuated daily, sometimes showing signs of improvement that filled Margaret with hope, other times appearing so weak that everyone feared the worst was imminent. During one of their quiet conversations, Mrs. Eleanor had grasped Margaret's hand with surprising strength and whispered something that had puzzled and troubled her ever since. "Margaret, my dear friend," she had said, her voice barely audible, "if something happens to me, promise me you'll remember that things aren't always what they appear to be. The truth has a way of revealing itself when people least expect it," Margaret had promised. Though she didn't fully understand what Mrs. Eleanor meant at the time, she assumed it was simply the rambling of someone weakened by illness. But something in Mrs. Eleanor's eyes suggested there was more to her words than simple confusion. The household staff had been instructed to maintain their regular duties while being prepared for any eventuality. Margaret noticed that Robert had been making frequent phone calls to funeral directors, florists, and caterers, efficiently organizing what he referred to as the inevitable arrangements. His businesslike approach to his wife's impending death struck Margaret as coldly practical, lacking the emotion she would have expected from a grieving husband. Late one evening, as Margaret was finishing her duties in the kitchen, she heard commotion from upstairs. Footsteps hurried down the hallway, voices called out urgently, and she knew that Mrs. Eleanor's condition had taken a turn for the worse. Dr. Harrison, the family physician, arrived within the hour, his grim expression confirming everyone's fears as he emerged from the bedroom and spoke quietly with Robert and the boys. The next morning, the house was filled with a heavy silence that seemed to press down on everyone within its walls. Robert appeared in the kitchen where Margaret was preparing breakfast, his face composed but his eyes reflecting what might have been relief as much as sorrow. "Mrs. Whitmore passed peacefully during the night," he announced to the gathered staff. "The funeral arrangements will be finalized today, and will be receiving visitors throughout the week." Margaret felt her world shift as the news settled over her like a heavy blanket. Mrs. Eleanor was gone, taking with her the warmth and kindness that had made Margaret's job feel more like caring for family than simply working for employers. As she stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of the house she had maintained for so many years, Margaret realized that everything was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The days following Mrs. Eleanor's death blurred together in a whirlwind of activity that transformed the usually peaceful Whitmore estate into a bustling center of funeral preparations. Margaret threw herself into her work with renewed dedication, finding comfort in the familiar routines of cleaning and organizing, while the family dealt with their grief and the complexities of laying their matriarch to rest. Robert Whitmore moved through the arrangements with the same efficiency he brought to his business dealings. Within hours of his wife's passing, he had contacted Preston and Associates, the most prestigious funeral home in the city, and began orchestrating what he described as a service befitting Eleanor's station in the community. The guest list included politicians, business leaders, and socialites who had moved in the Whitmore circle for decades. Margaret observed the preparations with a mixture of sadness and growing discomfort. While she understood that wealthy families often held elaborate funeral services, something about the speed and scale of the arrangements felt wrong to her. Mrs. Eleanor had been a private person who preferred quiet gatherings to grand social events. She had often mentioned to Margaret how much she disliked the pretentious parties that Robert insisted they host for business purposes. The funeral director, a tall, thin man named Mr. Preston, arrived at the estate with his assistants to discuss the details. Margaret served coffee in the main living room as Robert, James, and Michael met with Preston to finalize the arrangements. She couldn't help but overhear their conversation as she moved quietly around the room, refreshing drinks and ensuring everything was perfect. "We'll need the largest chapel," Robert was saying, his voice steady and businesslike. Mrs. Whitmore was well known in the community, and we expect several hundred attendees. The service should reflect her position in society and our family's standing. Mr. Preston nodded gravely, making notes in his leather-bound folder. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. We'll arrange for the finest casket, premium floral arrangements, and our most experienced staff. The viewing will be tomorrow evening, with the funeral service the following morning. We'll handle every detail to ensure a dignified farewell." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as she listened to the clinical discussion of Mrs. Eleanor's funeral. These men were talking about someone she had loved and cared for, as if she were simply another business transaction to be managed. There was no mention of Mrs. Eleanor's preferences, her personality, or the things that had made her special to those who knew her well. That evening, as Margaret was cleaning the dishes from the family's dinner, Sarah called from California. Margaret's daughter had become a successful physician and had maintained a warm relationship with Mrs. Eleanor, who had always been proud of Sarah's accomplishments and grateful for the opportunity to help with her education. "Mom, I just heard about Mrs. Eleanor," Sarah said, her voice filled with genuine sadness. "I'm so sorry. I know how much she meant to you." "Are you okay?" Margaret found herself crying for the first time since receiving the news. "She was like family to me, Sarah. More than family in some ways. I don't know what I'm going to do without her." "I wish I could be there with you," Sarah said gently. I tried to get time off to fly back for the funeral, but we're in the middle of a critical rotation and I can't leave my patients. Will you be all right? Margaret assured her daughter that she would manage, but after hanging up the phone, she felt more alone than she had in years. Mrs. Eleanor had been her closest friend, confidant, and the person who had made her feel valued and appreciated in a household where the other family members barely acknowledged her existence. The next day brought a steady stream of florists, caterers, and funeral staff to the estate. Margaret coordinated with them as needed, ensuring they had access to the appropriate areas while maintaining the household's regular operations. She noticed that Robert seemed almost energized by the activity, moving through the preparations with an enthusiasm that struck her as inappropriate for someone who had just lost his wife of 35 years. The viewing was held at Preston and Associates' funeral home, in their grandest chapel decorated with hundreds of white lilies and roses. Margaret arrived early, wanting a few quiet moments with Mrs. Eleanor before the crowds arrived. She had worn her best dress, a simple black outfit that Mrs. Eleanor had complimented her on several times over the years. As Margaret approached the casket, she was struck by how peaceful Mrs. Eleanor looked, but also how different she appeared from the vibrant woman she remembered. The funeral home had done an excellent job with the preparation, but something seemed off to Margaret. Though she couldn't quite identify what was troubling her, the viewing drew hundreds of people just as Robert had predicted. Business associates, social acquaintances, and community leaders filled the chapel, offering condolences to the family and sharing memories of Mrs. Eleanor's charitable work and social contributions. Margaret stood quietly in the back of the room, watching the elaborate display of grief and remembrance. She noticed that many of the people offering condolences seemed to know Mrs. Eleanor only superficially, speaking in general terms about her kindness and community involvement, rather than sharing specific personal memories. It struck Margaret that despite being surrounded by all these people, Mrs. Eleanor might have been lonelier in life than anyone realized. As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself thinking about Mrs. Eleanor's cryptic words about truth revealing itself when least expected. She had dismissed the comment as the confused rambling of someone weakened by illness, but now she wondered if there had been more meaning behind those words than she had initially understood. Robert moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting sympathy and managing conversations with the skill of someone accustomed to networking at social events. James and Michael flanked him, presenting a united front of dignified grief that impressed the attendees but felt hollow to Margaret, who had observed the family's actual dynamics for over 2 decades. Late that evening, after the last visitors had departed and the funeral home staff had begun preparing for the next day's service, Margaret remained in the chapel for a few final moments alone with Mrs. Eleanor. She approached the casket one last time, placing her hand gently on the polished wood and whispering a private goodbye to the woman who had changed her life in so many ways. As she prepared to leave, Margaret noticed something that made her pause. A small detail about Mrs. Eleanor's appearance in the casket struck her as wrong, but the chapel's lighting was dim, and she convinced herself that her grief was making her imagine things that weren't there. She gathered her purse and coat, said one final goodbye, and headed home to prepare for what would be Mrs. Eleanor's final day above ground. The morning of Mrs. Eleanor's funeral dawned gray and overcast, with heavy clouds promising rain before the day was through. Margaret arrived at the funeral home early, as she had volunteered to help coordinate the final details and ensure that everything proceeded smoothly for the family. Despite her grief, she felt a responsibility to make sure Mrs. Eleanor's send-off was as dignified as possible. The chapel had been transformed overnight into an even more elaborate setting than the previous evening's viewing. Massive floral arrangements lined the walls, filled the altar area, and created a fragrant garden of white roses, lilies, and baby's breath. The guest book table was already surrounded by early arrivals eager to sign their names and be seen paying their respects. To one of the community's most prominent families, Margaret positioned herself near the back of the chapel, where she could observe the proceedings while remaining unobtrusive. As a member of the household staff, she understood her place in the social hierarchy, even during such solemn occasions. However, her long relationship with Mrs. Eleanor gave her a unique perspective on the woman being honored, one that differed significantly from the sanitized version being presented to the public. Robert Whitmore arrived with his sons, All three men dressed in perfectly tailored black suits and displaying expressions of appropriate grief. They took their positions in the front pew, accepting condolences from the steady stream of attendees who approached to offer their sympathies. Margaret watched Robert's performance with growing unease, noting how he seemed to relish the attention and sympathy he was receiving. The Reverend Matthews, who had officiated at many high society funerals throughout his career, took his place at the podium and began the service with traditional hymns and readings. His eulogy painted Mrs. Eleanor as a devoted wife, loving mother, and pillar of the community who had dedicated her life to charitable causes and social improvement. While these descriptions weren't entirely inaccurate, Margaret knew they only scratched the surface of who Mrs. Eleanor had truly been. As the service progressed, Margaret found herself remembering the private conversations she had shared with Mrs. Eleanor over the years. The real woman had been far more complex than the saint being described from the pulpit. She had struggled with loneliness in her marriage, felt constrained by the social expectations placed on wealthy wives, and had often expressed regret about opportunities she had missed in favor of fulfilling her family obligations. Mrs. Eleanor had confided to Margaret that she had once wanted to be a teacher, but her family had insisted she marry Robert for the financial and social advantages the union would bring. She had loved her sons but had felt disconnected from them as they grew older and became more focused on the family business than on maintaining personal relationships. Her charitable work, while genuine, had also served as an escape from the suffocating atmosphere of her privileged but emotionally barren existence. During one of their garden conversations, Mrs. Eleanor had told Margaret about a secret savings account she had maintained for years, gradually setting aside money from her household allowance and small inheritance from her parents. "It's my freedom fund," she had said with a rare smile. "Someday I'm going to use that money to do something completely unexpected, something that would shock everyone who thinks they know me." Margaret had laughed at the time, assuming Mrs. Eleanor was simply daydreaming about escaping her responsibilities. But now, as she sat listening to the Reverend's generic praise for a woman he had barely known, she wondered if Mrs. Eleanor had been more serious about those escape fantasies than she had let on. The funeral service proceeded according to the carefully planned schedule. Business associates and social acquaintances rose to share brief, polished memories of Mrs. Eleanor's contributions to various charitable organizations and community projects. Their words were respectful but impersonal, revealing how few people had truly known the woman behind the public persona. James Whitmore delivered a eulogy on behalf of the family, speaking in measured tones about his mother's dedication to her husband and children. His words were appropriate and well-crafted, but Margaret noticed that he focused primarily on Mrs. Eleanor's role as a supporting player in the family's success, rather than celebrating her individual achievements or personality. It struck her that even in death, Mrs. Eleanor was being defined primarily by her relationships to the men in her life. As the service neared its conclusion, Margaret felt a growing sense of unease that had been building throughout the morning. Something about the entire situation felt wrong to her, though she couldn't articulate exactly what was troubling her. The elaborate funeral, the carefully orchestrated grief, the speed with which everything had been arranged. It all seemed designed more to impress the community than to genuinely honor Mrs. Eleanor's memory. The Reverend announced that the family would be proceeding to Greenwood Cemetery for a private burial service, limited to immediate family and close friends. Margaret had not been invited to this portion of the proceedings, which didn't surprise her given her position as household staff, but it did increase her feeling of being excluded from the final farewell to someone who had meant so much to her. As the mourners began filing out of the chapel, following the casket to the waiting hearse, Margaret noticed Mr. Preston speaking quietly with Robert near the chapel entrance. Their conversation appeared urgent, and she could see Robert nodding emphatically at whatever the funeral director was telling him. When their discussion concluded, Robert's expression seemed relieved rather than grief-stricken. Margaret decided to follow the funeral procession to the cemetery, even though she hadn't been officially invited to attend the burial. She felt she owed it to Mrs. Eleanor to be present for her final moments above ground, regardless of social protocols. She climbed into her old sedan and joined the long line of expensive cars making their way across town to Greenwood Cemetery. The cemetery was one of the oldest and most prestigious in the city, with elaborate monuments and mausoleums marking the final resting places of prominent families going back several generations. The Whitmore family plot was located on a hill overlooking the rest of the grounds, surrounded by mature oak trees that provided shade and privacy for the burial service. Margaret parked at a respectful distance and walked to where she could observe the proceedings without intruding on the family's privacy. A smaller group of about 30 people had gathered around the gravesite, including the immediate family, a few close business associates, and some longtime family friends. The actual burial service was briefer and more intimate than the chapel ceremony, with the reverend offering final prayers before the casket was lowered into the ground. As Margaret watched from afar, she found herself thinking once again about Mrs. Eleanor's mysterious words about truth revealing itself. Standing there in the cemetery surrounded by the elaborate monuments to wealth and social status, she felt more convinced than ever that there were secrets about the Whitmore family that she didn't understand. The question was whether those secrets had died with Mrs. Eleanor, or were waiting to be discovered by someone who cared enough to look for them. The weeks following Mrs. Eleanor's funeral brought significant changes to the Whitmore household that made Margaret increasingly uncomfortable with her position in the family's employ. Robert had wasted no time in implementing what he called necessary adjustments to the household operations, changes that seemed designed more to erase his wife's presence than to honor her memory. Within days of the burial, Robert had instructed Margaret to pack up all of Mrs. Eleanor's personal belongings from their shared bedroom and move them to storage in the estate's basement. The task proved emotionally devastating for Margaret, who found herself handling items that held precious memories of their friendship. Mrs. Eleanor's jewelry, clothing, books, and personal mementos were all unceremoniously boxed up and removed from the living spaces, as if she had never existed. Among Mrs. Eleanor's possessions, Margaret discovered several items that puzzled her. There was a small notebook filled with what appeared to be financial calculations in Mrs. Eleanor's handwriting, listing various amounts and dates that didn't correspond to any household expenses Margaret was familiar with. She also found a business card for a private investigator named Detective Frank Morrison, along with several newspaper clippings about estate law and inheritance rights that had been carefully saved and organized. Most intriguing of all was a safety deposit box key that Margaret found hidden inside an old jewelry box, along with a handwritten note that simply read, "For Margaret when the time is right. You'll know what to do." The discovery sent chills down Margaret's spine, as it seemed to confirm that Mrs. Eleanor had indeed been planning something significant before her death. Margaret decided to keep these mysterious items rather than include them with the rest of Mrs. Eleanor's belongings destined for storage. Something told her that Mrs. Eleanor had intended for her to find these things, and the cryptic note seemed to confirm that suspicion. She tucked the notebook, business card, key, and clippings into her own room, unsure of what they meant but convinced they were important. The household dynamics had shifted dramatically since Mrs. Eleanor's death. Robert, who had always been distant and businesslike with the staff, became even more authoritative and demanding. He made it clear that he expected the house to run with military precision, with no tolerance for the small inefficiencies or personal touches that Mrs. Eleanor had previously allowed. James and Michael visited more frequently now, spending long hours in their father's study discussing business matters and what Margaret overheard as estate planning and asset redistribution. Their conversations often extended late into the evening, accompanied by expensive whiskey and the kind of satisfied laughter that suggested profitable decisions were being made. Margaret noticed that the son seemed particularly interested in liquidating various assets that had been important to their mother. Mrs. Eleanor's art collection was appraised and sold within a month of her death. Her prized rose garden was scheduled to be replaced with a more practical landscape design that would require less maintenance. Even her charitable commitments were being systematically canceled or transferred to other organizations. The most troubling change, however, was Robert's attitude toward Margaret herself. While he had never been particularly warm, he had always treated her with professional courtesy out of respect for his wife's fondness for her. Now he seemed to view Margaret as an unnecessary reminder of Eleanor's presence, making comments about streamlining the household staff and reducing redundant positions. Margaret's anxiety about her job security was compounded by her growing suspicion that something had been fundamentally wrong about Mrs. Eleanor's death and funeral. The timing had been so convenient for Robert's business plans, and his behavior afterward suggested relief rather than genuine grief. She found herself thinking constantly about the mysterious items she had discovered, and Mrs. Eleanor's cryptic warning about truth revealing itself. After several sleepless nights of wrestling with her concerns, Margaret decided to contact Detective Frank Morrison, whose business card she had found among Mrs. Eleanor's hidden possessions. She wasn't sure what she hoped to accomplish, but she felt compelled to understand why Mrs. Eleanor had been in contact with a private investigator and what significance it might have. Margaret called Morrison's office from her room one evening, speaking quietly to avoid being overheard by anyone in the main house. Morrison's voice was gruff but not unfriendly, and he seemed unsurprised to hear from her. "Mrs. Whitmore told me someone might contact me after her death," Morrison said, his words sending a shiver through Margaret. "She was very specific that if anything happened to her, I should cooperate fully with anyone who found my card among her belongings." "Are you Margaret Thompson?" "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "She mentioned me by name?" "She did indeed. Said you were the only person in that house she trusted completely. Look, I can't discuss the details over the phone, but if you're willing to meet in person, I have some information that Mrs. Whitmore wanted you to have. She was very clear that this information should only be shared if something happened to her." They arranged to meet the following afternoon at a small coffee shop downtown, far from the Whitmore estate and the social circles where Margaret might be recognized. Margaret told Robert she needed to run personal errands in town, a request he granted with obvious irritation, and a reminder that such absences should be kept to a minimum. Detective Morrison turned out to be a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and the careful demeanor of someone who had spent years dealing with family, secrets, and corporate mysteries. He ordered coffee for both of them and pulled out a manila envelope that he placed carefully on the table between them. "Mrs. Whitmore hired me about 6 months ago," Morrison began, his voice low and serious. "She suspected that her husband was planning something that would affect her negatively, and she wanted to gather evidence to protect herself. What I discovered was quite disturbing." Morrison explained that Mrs. Eleanor had become suspicious when Robert began pressuring her to sign various legal documents that he claimed were routine estate planning updates. When she consulted with an attorney independently, she learned that the documents would actually have given Robert complete control over assets that were legally hers, including property she had inherited from her family and investments she had made independently over the years. She also suspected that Robert was having an affair, Morrison continued, and she wanted documentation in case she decided to file for divorce. The evidence I gathered confirmed her suspicions on both counts. Robert has been systematically positioning himself to take control of her assets, and he's been involved with his secretary, Linda Palmer, for over 2 years. Margaret felt her world tilting as she processed this information. Mrs. Eleanor had been planning to leave Robert, which would have made her death incredibly convenient for her husband. The timing of her illness and rapid decline suddenly seemed much more suspicious than it had before. "There's more," Morrison said, reaching into the envelope. Mrs. Whitmore was also concerned about her health. She'd been feeling ill for months, but her symptoms didn't match any illness her doctors could identify. She asked me to research her medications and discovered that someone had been gradually increasing the dosage of her heart medication to dangerous levels. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Mrs. Eleanor hadn't died from a respiratory infection at all. She had been slowly poisoned by someone who had access to her medications and the knowledge to make her death appear natural. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee cup, trying to process the implications of what Morrison was telling her. Detective Morrison's revelations left Margaret reeling with shock and disbelief as the full scope of Robert Whitmore's deception became clear. The evidence Morrison presented painted a picture of a man who had methodically planned his wife's murder while maintaining the facade of a grieving husband. Margaret sat in the coffee shop staring at the documents spread across the table, trying to comprehend how the family she had served faithfully for 20 years could harbor such dark secrets. "Mrs. Whitmore knew she was in danger," Morrison continued, his voice heavy with regret. "She came to me because she suspected someone was tampering with her medication, but she needed proof before she could take action. Unfortunately, We ran out of time before we could gather enough evidence to present to the authorities. Morrison explained that Mrs. Eleanor had been documenting her symptoms and medication schedule for weeks before her death, creating a detailed record that clearly showed the correlation between her declining health and the increased dosages of heart medication she was receiving. She had also begun secretly recording conversations with Robert about their estate planning, hoping to capture evidence of his fraudulent intentions regarding her assets. She was planning to confront him the week she died, Morrison said sadly. She had scheduled an appointment with a divorce attorney and had arranged to move her personal assets to accounts that Robert couldn't access. She was finally ready to leave him and expose his criminal behavior. But someone got to her first. Margaret examined the medical records and medication logs that Mrs. Eleanor had maintained, her handwriting becoming increasingly shaky as the poisoning had progressed. The evidence was damning, showing a clear pattern of medication tampering that had been designed to cause heart failure while appearing to be natural causes. The family doctor, Dr. Harrison, had either been incompetent or complicit in the scheme, as he had repeatedly dismissed Mrs. Eleanor's concerns about her worsening condition. Why didn't she go to the police immediately when she suspected what was happening? Margaret asked, still struggling to process the enormity of the situation. She was afraid, Morrison replied honestly. Robert is a powerful man with connections throughout the city, including law enforcement and the medical community. Mrs. Eleanor knew that accusations without ironclad proof would be dismissed, and she feared that alerting Robert to her suspicions would only accelerate whatever timeline he was working with. Morrison handed Margaret another document that made her blood run cold. It was a copy of a life insurance policy on Mrs. Eleanor's life, with Robert as the sole beneficiary, that had been taken out just 18 months before her death. The policy was worth $5 million on top of the substantial inheritance Robert would receive from Mrs. Eleanor's estate. The financial motive for murder was overwhelming. There's something else you need to know, Morrison said, lowering his voice even further. Mrs. Whitmore suspected that you might be in danger too. She believed that Robert would want to eliminate anyone who had been close to her and might potentially discover the truth. That's why she left specific instructions for me to contact you if anything happened to her. The revelation that her own life might be at risk sent waves of fear through Margaret's body. She thought about Robert's recent hostility toward her and his comments about reducing the household staff. What she had interpreted as cost-cutting measures might actually have been preparation for removing a potential witness to his crimes. Morrison reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder that he handed to Margaret. Mrs. Whitmore wanted you to have this. It contains copies of all the evidence we gathered, along with instructions for what she wanted you to do if she died under suspicious circumstances. She trusted you completely, Margaret, and she believed you were the only person who could ensure that justice was served. Margaret opened the folder with trembling hands and found a handwritten letter addressed to her in Mrs. Eleanor's familiar script. The letter was dated just 1 week before Mrs. Eleanor's death, suggesting she had known her time was running out. As Margaret read the letter, tears began streaming down her face. My dearest Margaret, the letter began. If you are reading this, then my worst fears have been confirmed, and Robert has succeeded in his plan to murder me. I know this sounds impossible, but I have gathered evidence that proves he has been slowly poisoning me while positioning himself to steal my assets and inherit my estate. I am writing this letter because I trust you more than anyone else in the world to ensure that my death does not go unpunished. The letter went on to provide detailed instructions for Margaret to follow, including contact information for Mrs. Eleanor's personal attorney, the location of additional evidence hidden throughout the estate, and specific steps to take to ensure her own safety while pursuing justice. Mrs. Eleanor had also included the location and access information for her secret safety deposit box, which contained financial records and additional documentation of Robert's crimes. She was incredibly thorough, Morrison observed as Margaret read through the letter. Mrs. Whitmore spent months preparing for this possibility, creating multiple copies of evidence and establishing contingency plans in case something happened to her before she could expose Robert herself. Margaret looked up from the letter, her grief now mixed with anger and determination. What do we do now? How do we prove that Robert murdered her when she's already been buried, and the authorities have accepted that she died of natural causes? Morrison leaned back in his chair, considering the question carefully. The evidence Mrs. Whitmore gathered is substantial, but proving murder after the fact is always challenging, especially when the victim has been buried and no autopsy was performed. However, we have several advantages. First, the pattern of medication tampering is well documented. Second, we have clear evidence of Robert's financial motives and fraudulent activities. Third, we have the recordings Mrs. Whitmore made of her conversations with Robert about estate planning. He explained that their best strategy would be to present the evidence to the district attorney's office, specifically to a prosecutor who specialized in complex financial crimes and domestic violence cases. The combination of the attempted fraud, the suspicious insurance policy, and the documented medication tampering should be enough to warrant reopening the investigation into Mrs. Eleanor's death. But we need to be extremely careful, Morrison warned. If Robert suspects that you have this information, he might try to silence you permanently. Mrs. Whitmore was very concerned about your safety, which is why she arranged for you to receive this evidence only after her death. You need to understand that pursuing this case could put your life at risk. Margaret thought about Mrs. Eleanor's kindness over the years, the opportunities she had provided, and the genuine friendship they had shared. She also thought about the injustice of Robert profiting from his wife's murder while continuing to live as a respected member of the community. Despite the danger involved, Margaret knew she couldn't allow Mrs. Eleanor's death to go unavenged. Mrs. Eleanor was like family to me, Margaret said firmly. She deserved better than to be murdered by someone she trusted, and she deserves to have the truth revealed. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure Robert pays for what he's done, even if it means putting myself at risk. Morrison nodded approvingly. Mrs. Whitmore said you would feel that way. She also said you were the bravest person she knew, despite appearances to the contrary. Are you prepared for what comes next? Because once we start this process, there's no going back, and Robert will stop at nothing to protect himself. Margaret took a deep breath and looked at the evidence spread across the table. The path ahead would be dangerous and difficult, but she owed it to Mrs. Eleanor to see justice served regardless of the personal cost. I'm ready, Margaret said with quiet determination. Tell me what we need to do first. Morrison outlined their initial strategy, explaining that they would need to approach the authorities carefully and strategically to avoid alerting Robert to their investigation. He suggested that Margaret should continue working at the estate for now, maintaining her normal routine while secretly gathering additional evidence that might support their case. The key is to act naturally, Morrison advised. Robert can't suspect that you know anything about his crimes. Continue doing your job, but keep your eyes and ears open for anything that might be useful. Mrs. Whitmore believed there might be additional evidence hidden in the house that we haven't discovered yet. Margaret agreed to the plan, though the thought of returning to the estate and pretending everything was normal while knowing Robert was a murderer filled her with dread. She carefully gathered the documents Morrison had given her, securing them in her purse along with the items she had found in Mrs. Eleanor's belongings. The weight of the evidence felt both burdensome and empowering, as she prepared to become an active participant in seeking justice for her murdered friend. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Morrison handed Margaret a small device that looked like an ordinary pen. This is a digital recorder, he explained. If Robert says anything. As Margaret prepared to leave the estate for what everyone believed would be the last time, she felt a mixture of terror and determination that reminded her of Mrs. Eleanor's courage in the face of her own impending death. She was about to risk everything to ensure that her murdered friend would finally receive the justice she deserved, and that Robert Whitmore would pay for his crimes. The drive to the predetermined bridge location felt both endless and too short, as Margaret's mind raced between fear of the physical danger she was about to face and anger at the man who had destroyed so many lives for personal gain. As she approached the bridge where her fake death would be staged, Margaret whispered a prayer for Mrs. Eleanor's soul and prepared to fulfill the promise she had made to seek justice, no matter what the cost. Incriminating or threatening, make sure you capture it. Mrs. Whitmore suspected he might become careless once he thought he had gotten away with murder, and recorded confessions could be crucial to our case. Margaret returned to the Whitmore estate that evening with a new sense of purpose, though she was careful to maintain her usual demeanor around Robert and the household staff. She went through her normal evening routine of preparing dinner and cleaning the kitchen, but her mind was racing with plans for how to search for additional evidence while avoiding suspicion. Over the following days, Margaret began systematically exploring areas of the house she had never thoroughly examined, looking for hiding places where Mrs. Eleanor might have concealed additional documentation. She was particularly interested in Mrs. Eleanor's private study, a small room adjacent to the main library that Robert rarely entered and had not yet cleared out completely. During her search of the study, Margaret discovered a hidden compartment behind one of the bookshelves that contained a small safe. Using the combination Mrs. Eleanor had included in her letter, Margaret opened the safe and found several items that made her heart race with excitement and fear. There were additional recordings of conversations between Mrs. Eleanor and Robert, photographs of documents related to the fraudulent estate planning scheme, and most shocking of all, a vial of liquid that was labeled as heart medication, but contained a substance Margaret didn't recognize. The discovery of the vial confirmed that Robert had indeed been poisoning his wife systematically, probably by replacing her legitimate medication with a toxic substitute that would cause the symptoms Mrs. Eleanor had been experiencing. Margaret carefully photographed everything in the safe before taking the most crucial items, leaving the rest undisturbed to avoid alerting Robert that someone had been there. As Margaret continued her covert investigation, she noticed that Robert's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and paranoid. He had begun asking the remaining household staff detailed questions about their activities and seemed particularly interested in Margaret's movements around the house. His suspicion made Margaret even more careful about her secret activities, but it also convinced her that Morrison had been right about the danger she faced. The breakthrough in their case came unexpectedly when Margaret overheard a phone conversation between Robert and someone he addressed as Doctor. Margaret was cleaning the hallway outside Robert's study when she heard him speaking in urgent, hushed tones about cleaning up loose ends and making sure nothing can be traced. Back, she quickly activated the recording device Morrison had given her and managed to capture several minutes of highly incriminating conversation. In the recorded conversation, Robert discussed payment for services related to Eleanor's situation and expressed concern about the domestic worker who was too close to Eleanor. The person on the other end of the call, presumably Dr. Harrison, assured Robert that there were ways to handle problematic employees that would appear accidental and raise no suspicions. Margaret realized that her life was in immediate danger and that she needed to act quickly to protect herself while ensuring the evidence she had gathered would reach the authorities. She contacted Morrison immediately and arranged an emergency meeting to turn over the new evidence and discuss protective measures for her safety. The emergency meeting with Detective Morrison took place at midnight in the parking lot of an all-night diner on the outskirts of town. Far from any location where Margaret might be recognized or followed, she had left the Whitmore estate quietly through the service entrance, telling the night security guard that she was visiting a sick friend in the hospital. The lie came easily, as her own life now depended on maintaining the deception that she was an innocent domestic worker with no knowledge of the crimes that had been committed. Morrison listened grimly to the recording Margaret had captured, his expression growing darker as Robert's voice filled the car with discussions of murder and cover-ups. The conversation between Robert and Dr. Harrison provided the missing piece of evidence they needed to prove not only that Mrs. Eleanor had been murdered, but that Margaret herself was now targeted for elimination. "This changes everything," Morrison said after the recording ended. "We have enough evidence now to present a compelling case to the district attorney, but we also have proof that your life is in immediate danger. Robert and Dr. Harrison are planning to kill you, probably within the next few days based on the urgency in their conversation." Margaret felt a chill of fear run through her body as the reality of her situation became clear. She had always known that investigating Mrs. Eleanor's death would be dangerous, but hearing Robert and Dr. Harrison calmly discuss her murder made the threat feel immediate and terrifying. She thought about her daughter Sarah, safely working at a hospital across the country, and realized that she might never see her again if Robert's plan succeeded. "What do we do now?" Margaret asked, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. "If I disappear from the estate suddenly, Robert will know that I've discovered something. But if I stay, he's going to kill me." Morrison had been thinking about this exact scenario since his first meeting with Mrs. Eleanor months earlier. Mrs. Whitmore anticipated this situation and came up with a plan that she believed would protect you while ensuring that Robert would be caught and prosecuted for his crimes. It's dangerous and requires perfect timing, but it might be our only option. He explained that Mrs. Eleanor had devised a strategy that would allow Margaret to fake her own death in a way that would appear accidental to Robert while actually placing her in protective custody. The plan involved staging a car accident that would make it appear that Margaret had died while leaving the estate late at night, possibly after discovering something she shouldn't have seen. The idea is to make Robert believe that he succeeded in eliminating the threat you represent, Morrison explained. While he's celebrating his apparent victory, we'll be presenting the evidence to the district attorney and arranging for his arrest. Mrs. Eleanor believed that Robert's arrogance would make him careless once he thought all potential witnesses had been eliminated. Margaret listened to the plan with growing amazement at Mrs. Eleanor's foresight and planning. Even while facing her own death, Mrs. Eleanor had been thinking about how to protect Margaret and ensure that justice would ultimately prevail. The complexity and thoroughness of the strategy revealed how desperate Mrs. Eleanor had been to expose her husband's crimes and how much she had trusted Margaret to carry out her wishes. The plan would require Margaret to stage her own death by driving her car off a bridge into a river during what would appear to be a late-night departure from the estate. Morrison had arranged for professional divers to be waiting underwater to rescue Margaret from the submerged vehicle before she could drown. The car would be recovered the next day with evidence suggesting that Margaret had died in the accident, while Margaret herself would be placed in protective custody until Robert could be arrested and prosecuted. It's incredibly risky, Morrison warned. If anything goes wrong with the timing or if Robert suspects it's a fake, you could end up actually dead instead of just appearing to be dead. But Mrs. Whitmore believed it was the only way to ensure both your safety and Robert's conviction. Margaret thought about the alternative, which was almost certain death at the hands of Robert and Dr. Harrison within the next few days. The fake death plan was dangerous, but it offered a chance for survival and justice that wouldn't exist if she simply tried to run away or go to the police immediately. "When do we do this?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her body. "Tomorrow night," Morrison replied. "We've arranged for the district attorney to review all the evidence we've gathered, and warrants for Robert's arrest will be prepared in advance. Once your apparent death is confirmed, we'll move quickly to arrest Robert before he has a chance to destroy any remaining evidence or flee the country." Margaret spent her final day at the Whitmore estate going through the motions of her normal routine while secretly preparing for what she hoped would be her escape from Robert's murderous plans. She cleaned the house with extra care, as if she were preparing it for someone else to maintain, and said silent goodbyes to the rooms where she had spent so many years caring for the family that had ultimately betrayed her. Trust Robert's behavior throughout. The day confirmed that he was indeed planning something sinister. He asked Margaret several pointed questions about her evening plans and seemed particularly interested in what time she usually went to bed. His false concern for her welfare struck Margaret as grotesquely ironic, given that he was planning to murder her within hours. That evening, Margaret received a call that she knew was part of Robert's plan to lure her away from the estate at the perfect time for an accident. The caller, claiming to be from the hospital, said that Margaret's daughter Sarah had been injured in a car accident and was asking for her mother. Margaret played her part perfectly, expressing shock and concern while agreeing to drive to the hospital immediately. As Margaret prepared to leave the estate for what everyone believed would be the last time, she